Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Well, this isn't a video I thought I would be making. In a bizarre turn of events, Nvidia has unlaunched the RTX 4080 12GB graphics card that was previously scheduled for a November release. Nvidia released a brief statement on this earlier today, which I may as well read in its entirety because it's so short. So they say, the RTX 4080 12GB is a fantastic graphics card, but it's not named right. Having two GPUs with the 4080 designation is confusing. So we're pressing the unlaunch button on the 4080 12GB. The RTX 4080 16GB is amazing and on track to delight gamers everywhere on November 16th. If the lines around the block and enthusiasm for the 4090 is any indication, the reception for the 4080 will be awesome. The decision to unlaunch this GPU is unprecedented and has a bunch of fascinating implications that are worth talking about. I'd go so far to say this is one of the most un-Nvidia-like moves I've ever seen the company make, and it's a very welcome change that will benefit consumers significantly, so you have to give Nvidia credit for making the right move here. So first let's talk about the possible reasons for this unlaunch. Obviously the biggest one is they received significant blowback and criticism for launching both the RTX 4080 16GB and RTX 4080 12GB with very similar names, back at their Ada Lovelace announcement presentation. The feedback was immediate and pretty brutal from many commenters, not just reviewers and people like us on YouTube, but people all over the internet in the enthusiast community. The feedback centered around two issues. One, having two products with RTX 4080 naming is confusing when both do not deliver the same or even similar levels of performance. And two, comparing this 4080 12GB card to previous launches clearly reveals that it should have been a product in a typical 70 tier with pricing to match. This was almost certainly going to lead to negative feedback in the reviews themselves, even if the card was actually a strong performer and offered good value to customers. And Nvidia historically aren't huge fans of criticism. The difference between the RTX 4080 16GB and RTX 4080 12GB card, as they were originally going to launch, extended beyond the difference in GDDR6X memory capacity. The 12GB model also had fewer CUDA cores, and in fact was set to use an entirely different GPU die, with the configuration listed at 9,728 CUDA cores for the 4080 16GB, but just 7,680 CUDA cores for the 4080 12GB, a 21% reduction. With clock speeds relatively similar on both models and reduced memory bandwidth as well from a 192-bit interface instead of 256-bit on the 16GB card, this would have made the 4080 12GB card quite a bit slower than the 16GB model. It's confusing and misleading to offer two GPUs with such discrepancies in performance and call them almost the same thing. These performance differences were even shown in Nvidia's first-party benchmark charts at their launch, and in subsequent articles on their website like the latest one for A Plague Tale Requiem. Keen-eyed readers will have noticed that the 4080 12GB doesn't exactly perform that much better than the RTX 3080 based on Nvidia's numbers here, without factoring in DLSS technology, which just added to the criticism that the 4080 12GB was receiving. We were expecting the RTX 4080 12GB to slot in somewhere around or just below the RTX 3090 based on Nvidia's benchmark numbers on average. Who knows where this would have ended up in terms of important metrics like cost per frame, but with the RTX 4080 16GB looking maybe 20% faster than the 3090, again, you don't want to have two similarly named products with that sort of performance difference. This could have led to situations where consumers head to the store to buy the RTX 4080, end up with the 12GB card thinking it has the performance of the full, more expensive 16GB card, and end up being a bit disappointed. It's often quite hard to spot the difference between different VRAM configurations in product listings on websites like Newegg, which is why we strongly suggest GPU makers don't use this sort of naming scheme. The other piece of feedback spawned many memes, and that was the RTX 4080 12GB should have been called at best the RTX 4070 based on its die, specifications, and expected performance. Lots of people quickly began calling this card the fake RTX 4070 or actually a 4070, and while we don't really care too much what exact model numbers Nvidia uses, we discussed this in a recent Q&A video, this whole fake RTX 4070 business was definitely sticking in the community. And of course, Even though we don't really care whether it's called a 4070 or something else, we definitely would not advocate for it being called the RTX 4080, the same as the 16GB card. Anything but that would have been sufficient. But there were some legitimate points to make about the card having the specifications we'd normally expect from a 70-tier product. The 4080 12GB had 46% of the RTX 4090's CUDA core count. In the Ampere generation, the 3070 had 56% of the RTX 3090's CUDA core count, and the 3060 Ti had 46% of the 3090. So the 4080 12GB based on CUDA cores wasn't even a 70 spec model, but perhaps even a bit lower. The 4080 12GB was also set to use AD104 silicon, and for the Ampere generation, the highest tier 104 die was the RTX 3070 Ti that used a fully unlocked GA104. So with all of this in mind, why on earth would Nvidia call this card the RTX 4080 12GB? We don't know for sure. However, our speculation for one possible reason is that Nvidia were trying to deal with a few issues and settled on this particular naming strategy as the supposed best compromise. They wanted to price this card at $900 US, which is far above previous 70-tier models like the RTX 3070 and 2070, both at $500 US. Rather than dealing with the blowback of raising the 70 tier's price by 80% in a single generation, they opted to shove this into the 4080 tier, which caused its own set of problems. I guess Nvidia felt that the problems created by having two 4080s were less big of a deal than having an overpriced 4070. However, it doesn't seem to have played out in Nvidia's favor, as they've now unlaunched that card and admitted it was confusing. There are other possible reasons as to why Nvidia would proceed with this odd unlaunch. It gives Nvidia the opportunity to better assess the market, and in particular AMD's RDNA 3 launch, before relaunching this product under a different name and possibly a different price. If Nvidia felt that the RTX 4080 12GB was going to be uncompetitive up against other options and therefore poorly received, they now have the perfect opportunity to strategize and come up with a product that's best for the current and future GPU market. What doesn't seem to be the case is an issue with the hardware itself. We haven't heard anything from board partners to suggest an issue with Ada Lovelace silicon or the actual 4080 12GB cards themselves. This cancellation seems purely based around the marketing and naming of the product. The decision to unlaunch the 4080 12GB is a huge win for consumers and absolutely the right move from Nvidia, so massive kudos for admitting a mistake and setting about correcting it. It's rare for large corporations to publicly admit issues like this and set about fixing them, especially before a product launch. It shows that Nvidia is still in touch with their customer base and do genuinely listen to feedback, which makes it all the more important to voice your opinion when Nvidia, or really any other company, does something that's bad or misleading for consumers. It's also such an odd move from a company that has proceeded with similar launches in the past, such as for the GTX 1060 3GB, the RTX 3080 12GB, and of course the infamous GT 1030 DDR4 model. They've also copped a fair bit of criticism for misleading laptop GPU names, often calling the laptop GPU the same as the desktop model in name, despite a gulf in performance. I guess for this particular launch, the naming problem was so prominent and received so much widespread criticism that it's kind of hard to ignore. Since Nvidia has admitted this type of naming is confusing, it will also make it much harder for Nvidia to pull something similar in the future. We will always have this statement to refer back to in the event that a future generation has a similar issue, but hopefully Nvidia has learned their lesson here and won't do something like that again. So what happens now? What happens to the RTX 4080 12GB? Well, this card isn't going to disappear into thin air. We are close enough to when the 4080 12GB was supposed to launch that this GPU is already being mass produced in the configuration intended for that card. So it's very likely the exact configuration we've been talking about will be repurposed for a different graphics card, a straight rename and rebadge to something else. If the slim possibility that they do something else, you'll probably see a minor specification difference, but really we should be seeing basically the same card come to market. Everything else though is up in the air though. The leading candidate for naming would be the 4080 12GB becoming the RTX 4070, but anything is possible here, including the RTX 4070 Ti, as I'm sure Nvidia had other plans for what the 4070 was going to be. There are no shortage of numbers though, and we really wish Nvidia would use all of them as it leads to the least amount of confusion. What would lead to the biggest win for consumers is a price adjustment as well. If Nvidia decides to go with RTX 4070 naming and also feels that $900 is an inappropriate price for that type of card, that would be huge news and make the Ada Lovelace generation more appealing. At the announcement, we felt pricing for the 4080 series was a bit high, especially for the 4080 12GB, so if the relaunch includes a price correction, that would be great. However, there's no guarantees that would happen, as Nvidia may want to protect their margins. There's been no indication on what will be returning in the place of the 4080 12GB, so we have no idea how this will impact launch timeframes, as it was supposed to launch in November. Nvidia have now confirmed that the RTX 4080 16GB card will go on sale on November 16th, so you'd think the 12GB replacement would be launched after that, maybe in December, but again, this is just pure speculation as we have absolutely no idea what Nvidia are planning here. Though one thing is for sure, this card is basically ready to go and be launched, so any delay would be to rebrand and repackage the cards. This unfortunately does place some unwanted additional work on Nvidia's board partners who were planning to release this model as the RTX 4080 12GB and were in the process of creating all the relevant packaging and marketing materials. Depending on how far an AIB was into that process, that's a fair bit of work, and you would hope Nvidia are compensating their partners for the inconvenience they've caused. Although, given the EVGA situation, I wouldn't hold my breath for that. We'll be following up with AIBs soon to hear their thoughts. The graveyard slot for releasing this news on a Friday or Saturday for us here in Australia makes it, a bit more difficult than usual. My other thoughts on this whole situation is that while it's an excellent move for consumers and absolutely the right move by Nvidia, and I can't stress enough that this is a good move from Nvidia and they should be commended for it, it is a bit embarrassing. The launch of Ada Lovelace hasn't been the smoothest, and I would be surprised if Nvidia were expecting the amount of negativity around the graphics cards they announced, in particular for pricing and naming. Having to make the unprecedented move of unlaunching a GPU because you got the naming wrong isn't ideal, but hey, admitting you were wrong at this point is far better than going through with the launch and getting destroyed in reviews. Luckily though, so far we have been reasonably impressed with the RTX 40 series. The RTX 4090 is a very powerful GPU that offers an excellent experience for high-end shoppers and finally makes high refresh rate, no compromise ray tracing a reality. It's not the best value GPU, as those flagship cards never are, but a 60% performance uplift over the previous generation is massive. You don't really need to consider DLSS 3 when deciding whether to buy it, which we had more mixed feelings on. From here, it will be really interesting to see what happens with Nvidia's GeForce RTX 40 series and what happens to the 4080 12GB. I'm sure a relaunch of this model isn't too far away, and hopefully that comes with a revised pricing model and better name. We're also not that far away from AMD's RDNA 3 launch, so a very exciting time indeed for prospective graphics card buyers. Anyway, that's it for this one. If you enjoyed this sort of little analysis video on the unlaunching of the 4080 12GB, then do consider subscribing to the channel and also supporting us on Patreon or Floatplane. That supports our independent testing so that, we can make videos like our previous Q&A series criticizing this and, just our independent testing in general. Our review of the 4090, all that sort of stuff is funded by Patreon and a Floatplane member. So big shout out to them. And I guess thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.